The water moved like it had teeth. Brown, furious, filled with branches and trash, and the things people never thought they'd lose. Against that current, a single cry rose above the roar, a sound so sharp it cut straight through the chaos. It wasn't human. It was a dog's cry, raw and frantic, echoing off the drowned walls of a collapsing neighborhood. She stood half submerged on the roof of a shed, barely holding together, a German shepherd with eyes wide and wild. For slicked flat, trembling not for herself, but for the whimpering bundle pressed against her belly. Tiny bodies, her newborn puppies, huddled into the fragile warmth of her ribs. Their squeaks were nearly lost under the flood's growl, but she heard them, every sound like a knife in her heart. The water was rising, inch by inch. She had no language, no words, only instinct, but instinct was enough to know. If help didn't come, her puppies would slip into the dark water and vanish forever. And so she did the only thing she could. She lifted her head toward the road where a rescue boat cut through the current and let out a howl so desperate it stopped the men inside mid-stroke. The storm didn't arrive with warning. It arrived with violence. By the time the sirens wailed through the town, the river had already broken its banks, and water surged through streets that only yesterday smelled of bread from the corner bakery and gasoline from the mechanic's shop. Now, everything reeked of mud, gasoline, and fear. The sky had a bruised color, that strange purple, gray that presses low on the earth, making every sound sharper, every breath feel heavy. Power lines hissed and spat above rooftops as the water reached them, sending sparks into the rain like fireflies lost in a nightmare. Car alarms shrieked, silenced a moment later by the rising flood. On the edge of town, where the backyards blurred into farmland, an old shed leaned crooked against the water's fury. Its tin roof rattled in the wind like a thin sheet of metal barely holding to its nails. And on that roof, claws digging deep into the rusted grooves, stood Sasha. Her chest heaved with every breath. Her coat, once thick and golden brown, clung to her ribs in dark-soaked clumps. Mud streaked her muzzle, her tail plastered against her trembling legs. But she didn't care about herself. Pressed tight into the curve of her body, sheltered beneath her belly, were 6 tiny, blind creatures. Puppies. Their fur was still soft, their bodies fragile as twigs, and their cries so faint they could vanish beneath the thunder's growl. Every time a gust of wind struck, Sasha lowered her head, licking at them, nudging them closer to her warmth, as if she could build a wall with her own skin. The water snapped at the edges of the roof, black and angry, swallowing fence posts, barrels, entire pieces of a world they once knew. She could smell the rot of drowned earth, the bitter tang of gasoline, and underneath it all, the sweet, milk-soft scent of her babies, still alive. She had already fought. She had dragged them, one by one, from the flooded kennel where they were born, pushing them against her chest, carrying them in her mouth. Twice she had slipped, nearly lost one to the current, but instinct had sharpened her claws and teeth. She was no longer just a dog. She was a soldier in a war the river had declared. Now, all she could do was stand. Stand and wait. Her ears twitched at every sound, scanning for something, anything, that didn't belong to the storm. Her heart beat so hard she thought it might burst, but her eyes never wavered from the horizon, where a faint line of movement cut across the water. At first, it looked like driftwood. But driftwood didn't move against the current. Driftwood didn't glint in the gray light. It was a boat. Men inside leaned forward, their faces shadowed under plastic hoods, shoulders straining as they pulled at the oars. Voices rose muffled by distance, carried away by the storm's howl. But Sasha's ears caught something. Tones, human sounds sharp and purposeful. She froze. Then, before she could stop herself, she howled. It ripped from her throat, raw and torn, a sound that came not from her body but from her soul. It startled even her, the way it echoed over the water like a blade cutting air. The puppies squeaked in confusion, curling tighter against her stomach, but she couldn't stay silent. She howled again, longer this time, her eyes locking onto the boat as if she could pierce through the rain and meet the men's gaze. One of the figures paused. She saw it. His head snapping up, his body stiffening as though the cry had struck him in the chest. For a moment the oars slowed, and the current tried to spin the boat away. But then, with sudden urgency, The men redirected, fighting to angle toward her. Hope was a dangerous thing in a flood. It could burn you as much as it could save you. But still, Sasha let out another cry, her throat aching, her voice carrying across the angry water. The boat drew closer, inch by inch, swallowed by waves, spit out again. The men's faces came into view, grim, strained eyes darting between collapsing houses and the trembling shape on the shed roof. Sasha didn't know these men. She didn't know what they wanted, or if they would even come close enough. But deep in her chest, something shifted. It was small, fragile, like a spark in the rain. A possibility. The river snarled, the wind howled, and Sasha pressed her muzzle to her puppies, feeling their fragile warmth, and whispered to them in the only way she could. By staying. By holding on. By refusing to let go, not until the last breath in her body was spent. Above the roar of the storm, her cry lingered, a thread of sound cutting through the chaos. And for the first time since the flood swallowed her world, she wasn't just crying into nothing. Someone had heard her. The boat lurched sideways as a log slammed against its hull, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the flood. One of the men cursed under his breath, gripping tighter at the oars. The water wasn't just deep, it was alive, pulling, twisting, clawing for anything that dared float across its back. In the stern, Matthew raised his head again. He couldn't shake it, the sound he'd heard moments ago. Not the groaning of timber, not the hiss of electricity, not the wailing of sirens. This was different. It cut through him the way a child's scream does, unmistakable, primal. He blinked against the rain, wiping water from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "There!" he shouted, his voice raw, pointing toward the leaning shed half, buried by the current. At first the others only squinted. To them, the grey blur was just another wrecked building, another piece of a town disappearing beneath the river's teeth. But then the wind shifted, and they saw it, the silhouette on the roof, the sharp outline of ears pricked against the sky. A dog. One of them muttered, disbelief sharpening his tone. Matthew didn't answer. His throat tightened. A German shepherd, unmistakable even from this distance. Her head lifted again, and that sound rolled across the water, even more desperate now. It hit him square in the chest. He thought of Daisy, his childhood shepherd, long gone now, who used to sleep at the foot of his bed, who once dragged him by the sleeve away from the road, when he was a boy too careless to look for cars. He thought of her eyes, steady, loyal, always watching, and something inside him shifted. "We're going," he said, already pulling the oar harder, fighting the pull of the current. The man at his side snapped his head around. "Matt, we don't have time. You know what the call said. There are families waiting on rooftops closer to the school. We waste minutes here, someone else drowns." Matthew's jaw clenched. He knew. He knew every second mattered. But the sound of that howl, it wasn't just noise. It was a plea, a command, something that wrapped around his heart and refused to let go. He met his partner's eyes, rain streaking between them like glass. "She's not just a dog, she's a mother." For a moment, silence. The others exchanged uneasy looks. The kind that said he's lost it, the kind born of exhaustion and fear. But then the boat dipped again, and the shepherd cried once more, her voice carrying over the water like the last flare fired into a black sky. "Fine," the man muttered, throwing his weight back into the oar. "But you're the one climbing for her." The boat groaned as it turned, the bow biting against the current, waves slapping up and over the sides. Every inch closer felt stolen, borrowed from a river that wanted them swallowed whole. As they neared, Matthew could see her clearer now. She was trembling but unbroken, her body hunched around the small, squirming lumps pressed to her chest. Puppies, he counted them through the blur of rain. 5, 6 maybe. His stomach twisted. How in God's name had she kept them alive in this? She barked when they came within 30 feet, sharp and defensive, teeth flashing in the dim light. Her growl was almost lost beneath the thunder, but he could feel it in his bones. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to abandon them. She would fight to the end if she had to. Matthew lifted one hand from the oar, palm open, his voice low despite the storm. "Easy, girl. Easy." The words were drowned, stolen by the wind, but tone mattered more than syllables. He knew that. Dogs always knew tone. The shed groaned, shifting under the flood's assault. Water licked higher, spilling across the roof's edges. The puppies whimpered, their cries sharp and high, and Sasha immediately curled tighter, eyes never leaving the boat. The men slowed their strokes, letting the current carry them closer, careful not to slam against the fragile structure. Matthew's chest hammered. One bad move and the roof could split beneath her, sending her and the pups into the churning black. He could see it now, her ribs heaving, her fur clinging, her eyes wide and wild but lit with something he recognized. Not fiance, the will to hold, to endure, to protect. It was the same look Daisy had worn the day she'd bared her teeth at a neighbor's dog twice her size when it lunged toward him as a boy. It was a look that said, "If death comes, it comes through me first." "Matt," his partner hissed, panic flickering in his eyes, "if she fights you, you'll both go under." But Matthew wasn't looking at the water anymore. He was looking at her. And in that storm-lit moment, he felt something anchor inside him. Not reason, not logic, but something older, carved deep into bone and memory. He whispered again, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm not leaving you." The boat bobbed closer, bumping against the shed's side, the impact shuddering through the thin tin walls. Sasha flinched, a sharp bark tearing from her throat. The puppies squealed. But she didn't leap, didn't retreat. She stood her ground, every muscle taut, every breath a growl. The river bellowed around them, impatient, hungry. Time thinned, seconds slipping like water through clenched fists. Matthew reached for the edge of the roof, his fingers biting into slick metal, and pulled himself up. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, stung his eyes, filled his mouth with its metallic taste. His boots slid against the tin, but he steadied himself, low and slow, palms open. Sasha snarled, lips peeled back, but her eyes flicked, just for a heartbeat, toward the bundle at her feet. That was all the permission he needed. He sank to his knees, the flood licking at his boots, his heart beating so loud it drowned the storm. The fight between them had already begun, not claws against skin, but trust against fear. One of them had to break, and Matthew prayed it wouldn't be her. The shed's roof shuddered beneath Matthew's knees, every groan of the tin sounding like a countdown. The water was already licking higher, seeping through cracks, pushing upward with a force that could splinter the structure at any second. He kept his body low, palms spread, making himself small, unthreatening. But Sasha's eyes burned into him like coals, the whites flashing each time lightning split the sky. She growled low, a rolling sound that vibrated through the thin roof. Her teeth glistened, water dripping from her muzzle. Matthew held her gaze, not with dominance, not with challenge, but with patience. His hand hovered just inches above the tin, trembling only because the storm rattled the whole world beneath him. "I know," he murmured, though she couldn't understand the words. "They're yours, you die before you let anyone take them." "I get it." The river snarled around them, tugging at the shed as if to prove him right. One wave slapped against the side, spraying up in his face, and the puppies whimpered, curling tighter into their mother's belly. Sasha instantly lowered her head, licking them frantically, as if sealing them to her with her tongue. The growl in her throat softened for a heartbeat, shifting into a whine. Matthew's chest tightened. That sound, it wasn't aggression. It was desperation. He reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a strip of cloth. An old bandana, once red but now faded, stained with oil from his garage. He laid it on the roof between them, letting the rain soak it darker. Sasha froze, nostrils flaring, eyes flicking down to the fabric. She sniffed the air, uncertain. He wasn't trying to lure her. He was just showing, "I come with nothing but hands." The shed jolted again. The puppies squeaked louder, tiny mouths opening in blind cries. Sasha whimpered once more, the sound caught between fury and fear, and when her eyes rose back to Matthew's, something in them had shifted. Not trust. Not yet, but something closer to a question. Matthew took it as his only chance. He inched forward, knees sliding against wet tin, his movements slow enough to make the seconds feel eternal. His hand reached out, hovering inches from the smallest pup. A fragile, trembling bundle pressed tight into Sasha's ribcage. Her growl rose sharp, teeth flashing. His hand froze. The standoff hung heavy. Rain hammered down, thunder cracked overhead, The river gnashed at the shed's foundation. But Matthew didn't pull back. His hand stayed, steady as stone, eyes locked on hers. "Let me," he whispered. "Please." And then, miracle or surrender, Sasha let out a long, shuddering breath. Her lips didn't curl this time. She lowered her head, pressing her nose against the pup as if saying goodbye, before sliding her gaze back up to him. Matthew swallowed hard. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the puppy. It weighed almost nothing, a feather of bones and wet fur squirming weakly in his hands. Its tiny chest fluttered against his palm, and he tucked it instantly into his jacket, pressing it against his own warmth. The boat rocked below. "You got one," his partner called, voice hoarse. Matthew croaked, barely trusting his throat. He reached for another. This time Sasha didn't growl. Her body trembled, her ears flattened, but she didn't stop him. One by one he gathered them. 5, 6, each tiny life tucked into his jacket like fragile embers he couldn't let the storm extinguish. By the time he reached the last, his arms shook with more than exhaustion. The puppies had gone silent, too weak to protest, their breaths shallow but present. He could feel them, all pressed against his chest, their warmth radiating through the soaked fabric. His heartbeat pounded through them, as if trying to lend its rhythm. But Sasha still hadn't moved. She stood rigid, eyes burning, fur bristling. She wasn't leaving, not without them. Matthew met her gaze, his voice breaking under the weight of the moment. "Come with me." The roof shifted, a loud crack splitting the air as a corner dipped. Water surged up, spilling across their paws. Sasha flinched back, barking at the flood as if it were an animal she could scare away. Her body was shaking violently now, every instinct warring inside her. Jump into the unknown boat with strangers, or stay and drown with her young. Matthew slid closer, his hand resting lightly against her soaked fur. She stiffened but didn't snap. He leaned near, close enough for his voice to cut through the storm, soft but fierce. "They need you. They won't make it without you." Another groan, louder this time. The shed was giving way. His partner shouted from below, "Matt! Now or never!" Matthew tightened his hold on the pups and turned back to Sasha. "Trust me," he said. The words were raw, ragged, but they weren't just for her. He was begging the universe itself. For one agonizing second, she didn't move. Then her ears twitched, her head tilted, eyes flicking from his soaked jacket to the fragile lumps inside. She whined, short, sharp, and then, with a sudden, desperate leap, she pressed against him, claws scraping, weight slamming into his chest. Together they slid, the roof tilting beneath them, sending them both crashing toward the edge. Matthew shouted, clutching the pups tighter, his free arm wrapping around her thick neck. And then they dropped, into arms, into chaos, into the rocking belly of the rescue boat. Water splashed up, the current snarling, the boat tipping dangerously before steadying again. Men grabbed them both, pulling, shouting, their faces pale under the rain. Sasha collapsed instantly against the floorboards, her sides heaving, her nose bearing against Matthew's jacket where her puppies whimpered. For the first time since the river rose, she closed her eyes. Matthew held her there, his chest burning, tears mixing with rain. Around them, the flood still raged, swallowing houses and dreams. But inside that fragile boat, 7 lives had been wrestled from its teeth. And for the first time, hope didn't feel dangerous. It felt real. The shelter was nothing more than a school gymnasium, stripped of its purpose, transformed overnight into a refuge. The basketball hoops hung useless above the flood of cots and blankets, while the scoreboard glowed faintly in the dark, as if keeping score of the storm itself. The air was thick with damp clothes, the sour-sweet tang of fear, and the low murmur of voices trying to convince themselves that the worst was over. When Matthew carried Sasha through the doors, soaked to the bone, the room stilled. She was no longer the snarling sentinel on a roof. She was a shivering silhouette, ribs stark beneath wet fur, paws leaving muddy streaks across the polished wood. Her puppies were bundled inside his jacket, their weak cries slicing through the heavy silence like tiny, fragile bells. Children pressed closer to their parents. Old men lifted their heads from their hands. For a moment, everyone forgot their own losses, their own ruined homes, their own fear. Their eyes clung to the sight of a dog who had refused to give up. Volunteers rushed forward with towels and blankets. Someone found a cardboard box, lined it with rags, and held it out as Matthew carefully lowered each puppy into its new makeshift cradle. The crowd exhaled collectively when the little bodies squirmed, alive, their squeaks weak but certain. Sasha lunged forward instantly, her nose darting from one pup to the next, licking their faces, nudging their bellies. She counted them the way only a mother can count. By scent, by sound, by heartbeat. When she found them all, safe and present, she finally sagged onto the blanket spread out for her body shaking from exhaustion. The volunteers moved carefully, keeping their distance at first, but children are braver than adults in matters of the heart. A little girl with pigtails tiptoed forward, holding out a piece of bread saved from her own plate. Her small hand trembled as she extended it toward the wary shepherd. Sasha's ears flicked. Her head lifted slowly, eyes glassy, still burning with that wild edge of survival. She sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring, then lowered her gaze to the girl's hand. For a long moment, nothing moved but the storm outside, rattling against the windows. Then Sasha leaned forward and took the bread, not with a snap, not with hunger's greed, but with the gentleness of a creature too tired to resist kindness. The little girl's face bloomed into a smile, and behind her, murmurs rippled through the room. Relief, wonder, something close to gratitude. Matthew sat nearby, his body finally sinking into a chair, every muscle trembling from the storm's grip. His hands still smelled of wet fur, of river water, of fear. He watched Sasha curl herself around her box of puppies, her eyes softening each time they squeaked. For the first time, she wasn't alone against the flood. Night fell heavy over the shelter. The storm still rattled outside, but inside the rhythm shifted. People laid down. Some whispering prayers, others simply staring at the ceiling, too wrung out to speak. The lights hummed, casting a dim glow across faces etched with exhaustion. Matthew didn't sleep. He kept watch, not because he had to but because he couldn't stop himself. Every so often, Sasha's gaze lifted from her pups to meet his. There was no trust yet, not fully, but there was no fury either. Something passed between them, an understanding carved not by words but by survival. In the quiet hours, a woman from the Red Cross brought a shallow bowl of water and set it gently near Sasha's paws. The shepherd hesitated, sniffed, then drank, her tongue lapping fast. Desperate. The woman wiped her eyes as she stepped away. It was the smallest things that undid people. The sight of a mother drinking after nearly drowning. The sound of puppies breathing who should have been lost to the current. Hope didn't come in speeches or sermons that night. It came in fur and whimpers and the slow, steady rise of Sasha's chest as she guarded her children. By dawn, when the rain had finally thinned to a drizzle, the gymnasium smelled faintly of coffee and wet dog. The floodwaters outside were still unforgiving, but inside life pressed stubbornly forward. Volunteers bustled, sorting donations, organizing rides, checking lists of the missing. But no matter the noise, no matter the shuffle, eyes kept drifting back to Sasha. She was more than just a rescued dog. She was a reminder that survival wasn't always about strength, but about love so fierce it refused to drown. Matthew stood by the doorway, his gaze steady on her. She caught his eyes once more, her ears tilting forward, her body lowering protectively over her puppies. Yet for the first time, her tail flicked once against the blanket. Not wagging, just moving. A small gesture, but enough to say, "I see you. I remember you." And in that moment, Matthew knew the storm hadn't taken everything. The water took days to recede, and even then it left behind a silence heavier than the storm itself. Streets that had once pulsed with life were buried under mud. Doors hung crooked, windows shattered, walls collapsed inward like lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. Piles of ruined furniture stood in front yards like monuments to lives dismantled overnight. Matthew walked those streets with others, boots sinking deep into the sludge, the smell of rotten gasoline clinging to his clothes. He carried sandbags, lifted beams, comforted neighbors who stared at the skeletons of their homes. But no matter how much work the day demanded, he always found himself returning to the gymnasium when night fell. And every time he did, Sasha was there. Her puppies had grown stronger with each sunrise, their whimpers sharper, their bodies rounder, nursing greedily at her belly. Volunteers would pause in their shifts just to crouch by the box, their hands hovering above tiny heads, their voices softening into coos. For people who had lost everything, those puppies were proof that life was still stubborn enough to go on. Sasha herself was changing. The wild fire in her eyes dulled into something steadier. She no longer growled when strangers approached, though she kept her body between her pups and the world. Sometimes, late at night, Matthew would catch her watching him, not with suspicion, but with something closer to recognition. She remembered. She knew. One evening, when the air finally smelled of earth instead of river, Matthew sat cross-legged on the shelter floor, watching the pups stumble across the blanket in clumsy steps. Sasha lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, her eyes half closed. A boy of no more than 10 approached, holding a broken toy truck caked in mud. He knelt and set it gently beside one of the puppies, who pawed at it with curious squeaks. The boy laughed, the sound bright and startling in the weary Jim. Sasha lifted her head, ears pricking, then simply lowered it again, accepting the child's presence. It was a small moment, but Matthew felt it bloom in his chest. Trust was growing, not in leaps but in inches. When the evacuation order was finally lifted, people began to trickle back to what was left of their homes. The gymnasium emptied, cots folded, blankets stacked, the echo of footsteps replacing the hum of crowded survival. Matthew hesitated. He stood near the doors with his bag slung over his shoulder, staring at Sasha and her puppies. A family had already asked about adopting one of the pups when they were old enough. Others had offered food, blankets, even a kennel. But Sasha herself, her future was uncertain. He knelt down, reaching his hand toward her. She sniffed it, her wet nose pressing against his palm, her breath warm. He scratched gently behind her ears, feeling the coarse fur, the tremble of muscles still learning to relax. "You saved them," he whispered. "But maybe you need someone to save you too." The decision didn't come in a rush. It came in the stillness between breaths, in the quiet acknowledgement that he couldn't walk away. Not after the roof, the river, the howl that had split the storm. So when the volunteers packed the last supplies and locked the doors, Sasha and her pups didn't stay behind. They followed him, paws clicking across the gym floor, tails brushing against his boots as though they had always belonged at his side. Life didn't return to normal in the weeks that followed. It couldn't. Whole neighborhoods had to be rebuilt, and some would never rise again. But amidst the wreckage, there were new beginnings. Matthew's backyard became a world of discovery for the pups. They tumbled across the grass, chasing each other in dizzying circles, their yips carrying through the air like laughter. Neighbors leaned on fences just to watch them, their faces softening for the first time in months. Children came to play, bringing squeaky toys and giggles, their muddy shoes forgotten in the joy of it all. And Sasha changed most of all. The sharp edge of her posture melted into ease. She still carried herself with dignity, her eyes always scanning, her body always ready. But when Matthew came home from long days of work, she would trot to him, her tail sweeping, her muzzle pressing into his hand with a sigh that seemed to release everything she had held back. Sometimes at dusk, Matthew would sit on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands. The sky would burn gold over the ruined fields, and Sasha would lie at his feet, her puppies sprawled in a tired heap beside her. He would watch them breathe, their chests rising and falling in unison, and feel the storm's shadow loosen its grip. She had once howled into the fury of the flood, her voice carrying across the water like a wound-made sound. Now, in the quiet of dry earth, her voice was different. She didn't cry anymore. She sighed, content, the sound of a mother who had fought the river and won. And when the world seemed too heavy, Matthew would remember that night, the roof, the rain, the moment her eyes had met his, and realize that some cries are not meant to be answered by despair. They are meant to be answered by love. On one such evening, with the last light fading, Sasha lifted her head, watching her pups tumble across the yard. Her ears twitched. Her eyes softened, and she let out a low, contented breath. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't even a bark. It was something quieter, fuller. It was the sound of peace. The river had come to take everything, but it had not taken her spirit. Sasha had howled into the storm, defiant, carrying her puppies through a night that should have drowned them all. And because of that cry, because of that fight, Because someone chose to listen, her story didn't end in the flood. It began there. Now, under skies clear and steady, her pups tumbled in the grass, their laughter, like yips chasing away the memory of thunder. And Sasha, scarred but unbroken, lay with her head resting against Matthew's knee, her eyes closing as though she finally trusted the world to hold her. Sometimes survival is not just about clawing through the waters. Sometimes it's about what rises after, the quiet proof that love is stronger than the storm. And in that silence, where the flood once roared, there was only the soft sound of puppies dreaming and a mother's breath of peace. The river had come with teeth, tearing through everything in its path. Homes, roads, the fragile fabric of safety. It came like a thief in the night, demanding silence, demanding surrender. But it did not take her. It did not take the mother who refused to let her story end in the dark waters. Sasha had howled into the storm, not out of fear, but out of love so ferocious it refused to be drowned. That cry became a thread stretched across the chaos, reaching the one person who would hear her. And because she fought, because someone answered, her story shifted from tragedy to survival, from loss to legacy. Now the flood was only a memory. The fields had dried, though scars still cut the earth where the water once ruled. Houses stood broken, their walls marked with high water lines like open wounds. And yet, in the middle of all that ruin, life bloomed again in the form of 5 tumbling, clumsy bodies chasing sunlight across the grass. The puppies had become more than Sasha's reason for fighting. They became symbols for everyone who had stood in that shelter gym, carrying their own wounds. Each wagging tail was a reminder that survival was possible, that joy could claw its way back even when everything seemed washed away. People who had lost everything would stop at the fence just to watch them. And for a moment, their grief loosened its grip. Sasha herself had changed too. The wildness that once lived in her eyes had softened into something steadier. She no longer stood braced against the world, as though it might collapse again at any second. Instead, she leaned into Matthew's hand, into his presence, into the quiet proof that trust could be rebuilt just as homes could. At dusk, the air turned cool and the sky burned with fading gold. Matthew often sat on the porch, coffee cooling in his hands, watching Sasha with her pups sprawled across the lawn. In those moments, he thought of the night on the roof, of the howl that split the flood, of the way her body trembled but never broke. And he realized the storm had not defeated her. It had revealed her. The flood had taken houses, belongings, memories, but it had given him this family stitched together out of water and will. And so, in the silence where thunder once reigned, there was only the soft chorus of puppies dreaming. Sasha lifted her head, scanning the horizon out of habit, then rested it against Matthew's knee with a sigh so deep it seemed to empty the last echoes of fear. Sometimes survival is not just about clawing through the waters. Sometimes it is about what rises after, the quiet, undeniable proof that love is stronger than the storm. And as the night settled, the only sound left was a mother's steady breath, at peace at last.